Well, good morning and a very warm welcome, everybody, to December's Social Business Coffee Break, our final SE100 Coffee Break of 2024, which today is exploring the topic of how to be a brilliant social enterprise employer. My name's Tim West, and I'm the founding editor of Pioneers Post, which is the magazine for pioneering entrepreneurs, investors, innovators, and policymakers working to create sustainable solutions for the world's most pressing social and environmental challenges. As you might know, Pioneers Post is not only a magazine, but we're also a social enterprise ourselves, with a mission to support our community of impact pioneers to build a better world through good business. And we do this not only through our journalism, but also with an ongoing program of webinars, awards, training, and networking opportunities. The Social Business Coffee Breaks are about both learning and connecting the pioneers in our community. They aim to give you a shot of social business inspiration to energize your morning and also to provide some practical tips to address the challenges that you face as you attempt to sustain and grow a thriving social business. These coffee break sessions are also delivered in partnership with NatWest Social and Community Capital, which is NatWest Bank's independent social investment charity, as part of the learning and networking program developed for the SE100 and WISE 100 awards community. Now, being a social enterprise employer can be both joyful and fraught with challenges. On the one hand, as a mission-focused organization, you want to run a happy ship of people who are energized by your mission and will work hard together as a team to deliver on your social and environmental aims. On the other hand, as an organization focused on purpose rather than profit, your margins will probably be tight and you might not have the ability to reward your team as much as you would like or to protect their jobs when times are tough. In this coffee break discussion, with the help of our expert speaker from Roots HR Community Interest Company, Jimmy van Santen, we'll be looking at how you can run a happy and effective team that will help drive both your mission and your business. We'll be looking in particular at the topic of flexible working, what it means, how you can set boundaries while meeting expectations. And we'll also explore the challenges of remote working, how to build and maintain a culture of inclusion and well-being. Along the way, we'll consider recent changes in employment law and issues such as zero-hour contracts. So we'll get into the topic in a moment, but as always, since these are coffee break discussions, we begin by asking our guests to tell us what they are drinking this morning. And first of all, Jimmy van Santen from Roots HR. Good morning to you and welcome. Tell us what you're drinking this morning.
Yeah, good morning, Tim. So I am drinking a green tea by Clippers. I don't think they're a social enterprise, but they're certainly fair trade. And yeah, that's my drink of choice today, just a kind of little zen.
Very good. Excellent. And Brendan Hegarty from our partners at NatWest Social and Community Capital. Now, first of all, I'm going to say congratulations because you're just back from your honeymoon and you've been to Marrakesh, I believe, and you're going to tell us about your drink, which comes from that trip that you've just been on. So, hi, Brendan.
Hi, Tim. Yeah, thank you. Yes, just back from well, not long back from, feels like a time ago. We went to Marrakesh, went to Atlas Mountains, and to the Berber people. We went to a women's co-op there and bought some herbal tea. So that's my drink of choice today is some herbal tea from the women's co-op in the Atlas Mountains.
Good. Very good. Thank you. Okay, today I've made a pot of organic peppermint tea from Nemi Teas. Nemi Teas are a previous winner of our SE100 Leadership Prize. And in fact, we gave some Nemi Teas as a prize in our last SE100 awards. Nemi provide training and employment to refugees to help them gain local work experience and job readiness to enter the UK workforce. And Nemi also happen to be one of more than 30 social ventures who partner with a wonderful social business called the Social Stories Club, who are known for creating sustainable gift hampers and who are busy at the moment, I'm sure, sending dozens of hampers out for festive celebrations. Social Stories Club offers job opportunities to people who are furthest from the labour market, to whom they pay a living wage to pack the gift hampers. And today we're going to be joined just briefly by one of the company's co-founders, Caris Gill, who I'm going to invite just to say hello and say a few words about your social business. Caris, welcome. Tell us what are you drinking this morning, and tell us about your organisation.
Thank you so much, Tim. I wish I had a better answer because I'm drinking water, but my go-to drink when it's not water is I allow myself one hot chocolate a day. And I choose, on the whole, Cafe Direct, which is a wonderful social enterprise which is in our gift hampers. And they're addressing the fact that 80% of farmers cannot actually afford to make a living. So they're addressing that really important social issues. If we want coffee and hot chocolate in the future, we need to address these challenges which are happening right now. So to tell you a little bit about our sustainable hampers, for those of you who have been wondering who has been putting gifts under your tree, Christmas tree for the last few years, that would be me. I am Santa Claus. Every year, we deliver thousands of hampers across the whole of the UK and beyond, and each of them are filled with chocolates, crisps, biscuits, teas, each that has a story of making the world a better place. Nemi Teas being one of them, which supports refugees. We also have soaps that have been designed by individuals with barriers to employment, chocolates that have been made by women who have previously been incarcerated. And the reason we started out at Social Stories Club was we had this vision. When we started, it was 7 years ago now, we actually had never heard of a social enterprise. We couldn't believe it. There are all these amazing companies out there that were doing amazing things to make the world a better place, and we had never heard of them. And I just saw this vision of imagine with every single transaction you made, you can make the world a better place, and you could help people to get jobs who didn't have them, and you could help fund education projects for girls in areas where education for girls is just not a priority. So I had this amazing vision of this world, and I thought the problem is people just don't know where these social enterprises are and how they could find them. So we started Social Stories Club as a way that if you know what a social enterprise is, you can introduce someone to this amazing world of social enterprise where they receive a story booklet and they can read up all about the different stories of all the different products inside their gifts. So that is why we started, and we started 7 years ago in Edinburgh, and we've had to learn everything about running a social enterprise from scratch, and we've moved up the warehouses and the premises as we've gone up, and we've created job opportunities for people with barriers to employment to pack the gift hampers, and we've tried to create the most exciting and sustainable gift, which is carbon neutral delivery, sustainable packaging, everything that we could. And we've learned everything as we've gone along. We have definitely not experts in business when we started. We've had to learn how to do it, and we're enormously proud of everything we've achieved. Now, a really big misconception about social enterprises is that they cannot fulfill larger orders, which is not the case for us. We've sent thousands of gift boxes out to customers for all of their staff and employees. And what we ask of people here is, if you know of anyone who is buying gifts at Christmas, if you can let them know about Social Stories Club and our hampers, because this is the key time of year for us where 80% of purchases people make are actually at this time of year for this sort of thing. So if you know of anyone, if you could share us on LinkedIn, if you could add me on LinkedIn, if you need Christmas gifts, if you could reach out to me. My name is Caris Gill. I'm very friendly. I will accept your connection invite on LinkedIn. If you could send me the connection invite, send us an email, let us know. And if you could help us get the word out, we'd really appreciate it. And thank you so much, Tim, who's allowed me to come here and spotlight Social Stories Club.
Very good. Well, we believe in good stories as well, so it's lovely to have you on. And yeah, you know, it's the time of year when everyone's thinking about gifts and things. So hopefully, you will get some good business. So thanks very much, Caris, for joining us. That's great.
Thank you, Tim.
Okay, so look, we've taken our first steps of climate-friendly coffee and tea, and it's now time to tackle the key topic of conversation: how to be a brilliant social enterprise employer. There's going to be time for Q&A at the end. Please also use the chat and the Q&A function to make some comments and ask questions along the way. However, For the next 25 minutes or so, we're going to hand over to Jimmy van Santen, one of the managers at Roots HR Community Interest Company. Roots is a member of our SE100 network and the only HR consultancy, I gather, to operate as a social enterprise within and for the social sector. And it uses its trading surpluses to provide pro bono HR services and learning and development to leaders working in the social sector. Now, Jimmy is the, and I don't know what this means, so I'm going to ask him in a minute, but the Comply, COMPLY service manager at Roots. So he can tell us what that means. But I know that he joined Roots in 2021 following completion of his Master's in Human Resources Management. He's also got an honours degree in Politics, Philosophy and Economics, and he previously headed the HR for a large national UK charity. Recently, he has written articles on what the UK budget means for employers and also a special guide on how to successfully manage Christmas parties. So Jimmy, a very warm welcome to you. Thanks for joining us, and over to you to bring up your slides and take us through the topic.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, and good morning to everyone. It's all great to see you. Just to kind of quickly mention who I am. So my name is Jimmy. I am indeed what we call a compliance service manager, which is our consultancy service here at Roots HR, where we support social enterprises like yourselves with any kind of HR queries you may have. And I'll get to the end about what free resources we have available for you, but we do actually have a real good mission here to make the kind of people story in our sector a good story, a great story, and we want to support employers like yourself in that. So I'll start to share my screen and then off we go, because the topic today, of course, is how to be a real and social enterprise employer. And there's so many different angles that we can tackle this from a HR point of view. But the hot topic today is all about flexible working. We read it in the news, big kind of people, big organizations are talking about flexible working and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. But here's the thing, we believe it is a good thing if managed really well. And so today we're going to spend a few minutes on that, on how you can do that in your organization as well. And of course, we have to understand that some roles are restricted by the very fact that they might have to work with clients and maybe are restricted by the hours that you open. Or the location that they have to work at. So we recognize that all, but we also recognize there are a lot of jobs that can be worked remotely or flexibly, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So I want to start with the legal part, because it's always good to understand what you're legally required to do in these kind of things. And in 2024, in April, we had an update to the legislation that essentially enhanced the rights of flexible working requests. And it means that employees can now make a request on the very first day of their employment. No longer have to wait 26 weeks before they can make their request. They can come in on their first day, hand you a piece of paper and says, I want to make a request for flexible working. And you're going to have to deal with that in the right way. Now, employees can make 2 requests per year. That's in a rolling 12 months. If I make my first request on the 1st of November 2024, then I'll get my request back again on the 1st of November 2025, provided I didn't make another request be within that. Whenever people make requests, the legislation requires you to consult with the employee only if you are planning to decline their request. Now, here's my best practice first kind of tip. I always recommend you consult with every employee, regardless whether you're going to approve or decline their request. And the reason that is that often employees will make a request, often driven by something that they need to deal with at home. Maybe it's childcare or they've got caring responsibilities. And they haven't really thought out some of the consequences of their request. It might mean lesser pay, or it might mean that, of course, they have got increased in costs, in energy costs working from home. Or it might mean that actually that there's more work to be done in fewer hours. So always have that discussion with the employee. And I always recommend that you do that even if you know you're going to approve the request, just so you can have that conversation with the employees, just so you can understand, have they thought about this, and are they actually willing to go through with this, considering it's a permanent change that we're going to make to the terms and conditions. I also always recommend that whenever you consult employees, to allow them to bring a companion to the meeting. Again, it's not a statutory right, but it's a good practice point of view to allow that. And the reason for that is a lot of employees are still very nervous to talk about this stuff. There is a power dynamic. You are an employer, they are an employee, and people still sometimes are concerned about bringing a request for flexible working into the workplace. So allowing someone that can accompany them and support them in that meeting is a really good idea. In my experience, it happens very rarely. Most people are quite happy just eventually to come in on their own, but knowing they can have that support in itself can help them maybe put the application in that otherwise they wouldn't do. The other thing you don't have to do from a legal point of view is to allow an appeal. You don't have to allow an appeal, but again, from a good practice point of view, and I think if you want to be a good employer, allowing that appeal essentially adds that check and balance in there. So because often this process is run by one individual in smaller organizations, it's the manager that deals with this. And so we only have really one person looking at the request and making a decision to whether it can be allowed or not. By allowing an appeal, it essentially adds that additional step in the process where you have someone else look at that decision and say, was it the right decision based on the facts available? And if the answer is yes, then you continue as it is. If the answer is no, then you may need to overturn that decision in whatever form that takes. So allowing an appeal adds a check and balance. It's not legally required, but I think it's a really good practice to have that in your process, just to get that extra check and balance in place. You need to complete the whole process within 2 months. So you can only have 2 months time to actually finish the whole process. And if you do allow an appeal, the appeal must be dealt with within that 2 months as well. In other words, the final decision needs to be made within 2 months. Again, my recommendation is not to wait until 2 months are up. It's usually really there for like large organizations or large HR departments where things have to go through different stages. If you're a smaller organization, hopefully you can deal with it in a very quick way, right? You get the request within the week, you meet with the employee, discuss the request, hopefully by the following week you'll make a decision. And if there is an appeal, then you can deal with it in the following week then. So usually about a 3-week period you can deal with this. And of course, if there's annual leave in between, then we have that 2 months to essentially deal with it. But the quicker you can deal with it, the better it is for the employee as well, because of course there's a reason why they're requesting it, and having that anxiety for 2 months of whether the request is going to be approved or not is not helpful in the great scheme of things. And finally, there's only 8 reasons why you can decline a request. I won't go through all of them. You will get a copy of the slides. But essentially, these are quite wide reasons to why you can refuse a request. But often what happens is organizations don't entirely know whether any of the 8 reasons apply. For example, especially the detrimental impact on performance or quality or be able to meet customer demand. In which case, you can actually have a trial period. So I always recommend, if you're not sure, don't make a decision. Introduce a trial period of, say, 3 months, test it out to whether the new flexible working practice works or not, and then make a decision at the end of that, again, following one of these 8 business reasons. You cannot decline a request just because you don't want to. It has to be for one of those 8 business reasons to be valid in the case of the legislation. So before we kind of start looking at what you can do outside of the legal framework, I just want to quickly have a look at the reality, because sometimes it's good to understand why we should do this. And if we actually look on the ground, what's happening, we find that there's multiple reports and surveys done on people and flexible working, because it is such a hot topic. Now, PwC found that 95% of millennials, as a people born between 1980 and 2000, find it important to have some kind of flexible working ability within their role, and 70% of them find it very important. In other words, it's a very high thing on the agenda for many, many people. If you look at all workers in the UK, and this is a report by the Equality Human Rights Commission, they found that about 91% of women and about 83% of men want some kind of flexible working in their job. So again, a really, really high number. And the same report showed that 400,000 people at the moment cannot go to work because there's a lack of flexibility in the roles that they can apply for. So 400,000 people not working only because there is not flexibility offered in the roles that they are suitable for. And a further 1.5 million people are reported to be trapped in part-time roles, often in jobs where they're overqualified and underpaid for what they've studied, got certifications for. Again, only because there is no flexibility in the roles that they want to go into or have been trained to go into. And so they are trapped in these roles. And depending on what statistics you look at online, you find them all sorts of things. I done a bit of research myself, and I found a 1 in 4 adverts, roughly speaking, will have some kind of flexible working mentioned within their job ads. It depends. It doesn't matter whether you go to charity jobs or whether you go to the kind of usual Reed or Indeed. 1 in 4 adverts usually show whether an employer offers some kind of flexible working practices. And that's not an awful lot considering the numbers of people that really want flexible working in their working life. And so you offering flexible working and being able to advertise that in your job adverts gives you a massive competitive advantage of gaining or attracting talent into your organization. So I really, really recommend, again, that if you can, and you do offer flexible working by default, which all comes to the bit, then make sure you mention that in the ad. You've all seen, if you have been on job boards, and it's been a while for me when I started looking for it, but I notice now there's a tick box on the top that says, you can tick it and it only shows remote working jobs. And if you again think about the number of people that are actually looking for some kind of flexibility in their roles, if you don't offer remote working, you are not being shown in the search results once that box is ticked. So just keep that in mind again as you kind of advertise roles and trying to implement some kind of flexible working practice within your organization. Now let's have a look at the benefits. Why do we want to do this? Who's the benefits? What's the kind of point of this all? I mean, apart from being a very good employer, obviously offering some kind of flexible working adds to the work-life balance. It increases often or improves work-life balance for people. In the majority of cases, there are cases where this kind of becomes a little bit more grey, especially where people start working from home all the time. The kind of border between work and life becomes very much eroded. But generally speaking, whenever we have flexible working, whether it is remote working, whether it is different ways of managing our hours, people's work-life balance in the kind of general improve. And what you often see then is that people are better rested, right? They are able to go home, they can reset, they actually have time for themselves, they're not always busy just doing chores. They actually have time for themselves to reset, to kind of just relax and get ready again for the working week. And that means we tend to see also an improvement in productivity. We've done actually quite a few pilots with our clients where we interviewed staff or we did surveys with staff. And one of the things we tend to get back from managers was that productivity, despite hours going down, despite people working more from home, productivity actually was going up or remained largely the same, but it never went down despite fewer hours and remote working. And so there's a very good reason for that. Again, people are well rested. They are much better equipped to actually start a working week and be more productive. And the other thing is that back in 2015, there was a very good study done in China, in Shanghai, I think it was, where they got 500 employees and they told half of them to work from home for 9 months. And what they found was just people working from home, people were 20% more productive compared to those working from the office. Now, of course, as an average, and you're going to have high and low performers, and so the number is going to be different all the time. But 20% average, more productive is a very good number. The other thing we tend to see as a result of flexible working is a reduced absenteeism. That means that people are less absent from work because of sickness absence. Again, if people are better rested and have time to kind of reset at home or in the weekend, then there's also less likelihood of actually feeling stressed or overwhelmed within the workplace. Of course, it's not a guarantee, but overall speaking, that tends to be an effect that we see within the workplace. The other thing we see, especially with remote working, people who may have not get into an office because they felt a bit snotty or had a cough and felt that they couldn't go to the office because they don't want to spread whatever they had, maybe want to work anyway and can do now because they can work from home. And so again, we see people maybe continue to work as a result of that. The flip side of that, of course, is that you now have an increase in presenteeism, which is the complete opposite, where people come to work or do work when they shouldn't because they really need to go and rest because they're ill, to the point that they shouldn't be out of bed. And again, as managers, of course, you want to be alert of that whenever you're going to introduce some kind of flexible work and we have people working flexibly in the workplace. The other benefit is that you can be more inclusive. If you think about it, when you have 2 million people, talent there who cannot work for whatever reason because there is not enough flexibility in roles. And so all of a sudden, you are widening your talent pool to people who are working parents or have caring responsibilities, or people with disabilities, or people from areas that where there's not a lot of money at the moment and they need a good job, but they can't get to the job to actually afford a car. So actually allowing some kind of opportunities for all of these groups of people means that you can be more inclusive, and as a side effect, you are widening your talent pool to a lot more people. So from an inclusivity point of view, it's absolutely amazing because you can allow more people to come and work for you because of that flexibility you put in place. And that, of course, has a massive effect on attraction. If we think about it again, back to the statistics, almost 90% of all people really need or want some kind of flexible working in their daily life. And so if you can offer that, you tend to find that people are willing to sacrifice some salary in order to be able to work flexibly. I work from home. I know I save thousands of pounds not having to commute to an office. And so I take that into account when I look at salary as well. And a lot of people do that as well. And of course, in the social sector, we tend to have lower salaries compared to maybe other sectors. And so this is one of those ways where you can create a competitive advantage for yourself by offering some kind of flexible working as an alternative to a higher salary. On the flip side of that, of course, retention, those people are already with you. Again, people are more willing to stay with you if you offer flexible working. Again, don't forget that only a minority of employers at the moment do still offer some form of flexible working by default. And so if you have those flexible working practices in place, you tend to see that people want to stay with you unless they can find a role elsewhere that offers something similar to what you already offer. Again, we've done quite a few pilots with our clients this year, especially around 4-day working weeks. And we have found that whenever we ask the question, do you want to stay at your employer before the pilot starts and then after the pilot has finished, the answer goes from 50-50 to 100% wanting to stay, because there is no way they're going to leave and go back to a 5-day working week. And the same applies to flexible working. People tend to want to continue with that once they've experienced that in their working life. And finally, cost. Cost is obviously a huge benefit, not just for employees, where they might have reduced commuting costs in terms of remote working, and also, of course, a reduced kind of travel time, so they have more time for themselves to spend with their family or their friends. But also cost to you as the employer. If you have remote working, if you have people working compressed hours, all of a sudden you'll find that you might need less office space to kind of accommodate all your staff. And so you can move to a smaller office. You have reduced energy costs. And all these overheads start to kind of add up over time. So as an employer, you can save money as well by allowing, especially remote working, which of course allows people to work from home. So all the way, how do you then apply that as a social enterprise employer to be as brilliant as you can be? So let's have a look. Best practice, really, we want to make sure that we have flexible working by default. So rather than relying on that legal process where people can apply for flexible working, why don't you kind of look at it from the point of, how can we make this work? What can we do by default to offer some kind of flexible working to our employees? And the two most common ones that we see with kind of social enterprise employers are time flexibility and then the location flexibility. So time flexibility often kind of takes the form of having operating hours, say between 6 and 6, but you tell people to work their 7 hours or their 8 hours within that period at a starting time and a finish time of their choosing. As long as they do the hours, it doesn't really matter when they start or when they finish. Now, of course, you might have, again, a service that requires them to be there between certain times. And again, you might want to think about how that works. Sometimes if you have a team, you can kind of tell the team to manage that between themselves, or you can make sure you have some kind of core hours in place. Now, a 6 to 6 often is a very good one because you tend to have always someone there between 10 and 2. So you can kind of play with those hours and how you would manage that. But the key thing there is that you allow people to choose their start and finishing time to kind of work around whatever private things they need to do. Maybe they need to drop the kids off at school. Maybe they have someone they're caring for and they need attention at a particular time, which requires them a longer lunch break. So you can kind of work with them on how that looks like for them. And if you can give them the freedom to choose their starting time, finish time, and how long the lunch break is, provided you trust them to work the hours they're required to work, then that's a very good way of introducing some kind of default time flexibility. Location flexibility is also one that we see, and we saw it a lot when coming out of COVID. And unfortunately, a lot of employers are moving back again to the kind of full office. That's often to do because they have leases and other responsibilities and commitments that they have signed up to. And so they want people to come back to the office to make full use of that. But after COVID, we saw actually a lot of employers, and still quite a few employers, offering by default some kind of hybrid model of working from home. And that often takes the form of a percentage of time that people can work from home. So maybe it's 40% from home, 60% from the office, or the reverse, 60% from home, 40% from the office. And again, it takes different shapes and forms of how employees manage that. Sometimes it's very much down to you as an employee to choose your days. Sometimes it's fixed within the contract. You know, you work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday from home, Thursday, Friday from the office, whatever that looks like. But again, having something by default can be very helpful, because of course you can then apply that in your recruitment, in your job ads. You can tell people about that, which again has a massive competitive advantage, because it all forms part of what we call our employee value proposition. And that employee value proposition includes, of course, your salary, your benefits, but also what flexible working you offer by default. The other benefit of offering by default is that often what you see is people will come in and really appreciate the flexibility that's already awarded to them. And so you don't tend to see people actually making further requests following that legal process, because they have the flexibility that's already in place. But on the flip side of that is that because you are offering flexibility by default, there is this kind of idea of acceptance of flexible working. And so if an employee then does need further flexibility within their role, they know they can apply for it, because the employee is not going to hold that against them. There's no stigma of flexible working within that organization, because you're offering that by default. So the other thing I want to always say is always offer be transparent with your processes. Make sure people are aware of the policies and the procedures. Make sure that they know that they can apply for these flexible working rights. Again, I've seen employees kind of try to hide it when an employee comes to them and said, hey, look, I've got childcare responsibilities and I'm really struggling with the hours I've got, and the employee doesn't want them to go through the process. That's always something I advise you against. Always make sure that you let them know that process is available. It's legal. They can go online. It's a quick search. They'll find it anyway. So always make sure they're aware what the policy is, or aware of the process and how that's managed and what their rights are within that process. The other thing is to be equitable. So in other words, make sure that everyone has the same opportunities to apply for these things. But with equitable also means you sometimes need to take into account further circumstances, right? If someone comes to you and they have a disability and actually they could benefit from, say, remote working because traveling is not great for them, then that's something in addition to think about when they are obviously making a flexible working request. It's not just a flexible working request at that point, and it's also a reasonable adjustment potentially that we need to consider. Training managers is absolutely key in this. Training managers in the process of how to handle a request is obviously very key, because you want that process to be very smooth, but also training managers on how to actually manage teams that are working remotely or working on different times than they are. And so it's all about making them understand what those processes look like. How do you performance manage a remote team? How do you look after people's well-being when you don't see them face to face? All those things are quite important when you have flexible working in the organization. Obviously, you want a culture of openness and trust. That's very key, because that shows people that this is a safe environment to request these things. Again, if you go out in the news, you find loads of people being very critical of flexible working, especially when it comes to remote working. And so what we really want to show to people is, hey, this is an organization where we're not critical of that. We're very open to this idea of flexible working, and we can trust you, right? If we have these kind of operating hours and you can choose your hours, that's a cultural trust, because we put that trust in you as an adult to make sure you still do the work, you still show up, but at times that work for you rather than what we set in the contracts. And finally, we want to make sure we include people. We continue to include people. One of the things that we unfortunately see when people work remotely or even more part-time for a few hours is that those in the office and those in the office full time are often awarded better opportunities, are often included in more socials than those who work from home or part time. And of course, that in itself creates an issue and friction between these two groups. And so again, as a manager, as a director, or as a CEO, what you really want to make sure of is that you think about those people that work from home. You think about those people who might not work on a Friday when the social happens, and how do you include those people in those socials as well? How do you include those people when opportunities arise? And how do you include those people when it comes to relationship building in the organization? And that often comes down to how, for example, you manage meetings. One of the things I always say is meetings are a very easy one to solve, because if you have, for example, a remote team that don't always work in the same location, then instead of having a group of people in a meeting room meeting other people on Teams, everyone goes on Teams, because that is a much more inclusive way of dealing with that. And that also then avoids those in the room having the bigger voice, because they are, of course, in a much more natural environment to have a meeting in the first place. Now, quickly on remote working, because I think that is a big one, and we tend to get a lot of questions about that. How do we make sure that we are indeed remote workers, and how do we make sure that we are good remote workers? I mean, one of the things, of course, that always is a good thing of remote working is that there needs to be some kind of suitability, right? People need to be suitable to work from home. In other words, do they have a place at home that they can work from? Have they got a desk at home? Have they got a chair at home? Because don't forget, when people work from home, whether it's a few days in a week or all the time, that home becomes an extension of the office, and therefore your responsibility to make sure they can work there in a safe environment. That means you still have to do what we call a display and screen equipment check, which essentially checks whether their working environment is safe and suitable for someone working. Always make sure you do that before you approve a request, because it's very key that you take that into account, and it allows you to essentially identify risks to that particular arrangement. And then once you've identified a risk, you can mitigate the risks through different means. Technology, of course, is very important. Make sure people have the right technology in place, laptops, the right Wi-Fi or internet they need to have to essentially have the Zoom calls and come to these kind of sessions. But also have the kind of technology in place like cloud technology, where you can store things in the cloud for easy access no matter where people work. Think about technology in terms of how people communicate with each other when it comes to, I don't know, internal comms or just general project management. You know, how do people track that when you are not in the same office, where you don't necessarily have a whiteboard, and start thinking about things like Monday.com, ClickUp, etc., those kind of apps to start tracking tasks or group tasks within the team. One thing, again, is really key is training of managers. Make sure the managers understand how to remote work, how to manage a remote team, and that especially includes how to performance manage a remote team. That's often very different to obviously people being in the office, because you're missing those informal contact points that you would normally have if you see people face to face. But also, how do you manage people's well-being when they are remote from you? How do you recognize the signs of stress, which is a lot more difficult to detect through a screen than it is to actually see someone in person? And so these are the kind of things that we want to train managers on, to understand how they can manage people when they're not in the same place as they are. Obviously, you want to maintain inclusion. I come back to that earlier point I made. If people are not in the office, make sure they're still included in all the opportunities that arise within the organization, whether that's promotions, whether it's creating new roles, or whether it's a social that you organize. Make sure that you allow those people who do work remotely to attend as well. Do it at times that work for them. If they have long distance to travel, think about those whenever you introduce some kind of social for the team. And finally, this is the absolute key one. Communication is key. Make sure your communication stays well and good. I always recommend you have some kind of communication strategy, especially when you have people working remotely from each other, just so that there is a clear understanding of how you're going to communicate. Again, those informal contact points that are often undervalued when we're in the office, but are very key to actually doing work and communicating things to each other and thinking of ideas. And it's one of the first things that will fail when people start working remotely. So communication is absolutely key. And again, Here at Root, for example, we have this real kind of process in place where we use Teams an awful lot, right? We have groups within Teams, we have one-on-one Teams, we have Teams meetings over Teams, we have face-to-face meetings every quarter, just to kind of keep that communication up. And we have a real strategy in place to understand how we communicate in the best way possible, and to ensure that we still have that collaboration, that still that creativity when we do projects, just so we keep that communication up. It's an absolute key thing. It's the first thing that tends to fail when you start seeing teams working remotely from each other. Finally, I want to quickly just look at culture and remote work. And again, culture is often something that falls away a little bit when people work remotely. One of the things you tend to find when you are surveying people, interviewing people that work remotely, is that they feel disconnected from the organization, disconnected from the team as a result. And that's mainly because, again, being in the presence of people, being in a physical environment, of course, is always going to have that feeling of being part of something much bigger. Where if you're from home and you're constantly looking through a camera and a screen, it's much more difficult to feel that. And so whenever we have people working remotely, we need to think about the culture and how do we maintain the culture. Again, the first thing is to make sure, of course, you've got a culture of inclusion, make sure that you absolutely include everyone as much as possible. Again, thinking about what kind of process you follow. If you have team meetings and people are in different places, make sure that everyone's on Teams, for example, or everyone's on Zoom, rather than having a kind of hybrid version of that. Making sure that, again, when you organize things, you have people come to the same place at the same time and think about travel times and all that kind of stuff. That comes along with that. Include people all the time and make sure you do that. Also, always remind people of the organizational values. We do this all the time as well. We constantly look at our values in our team meetings, our values, our mission, our statements that we have. What does it actually mean and how do I contribute to those values? How do I contribute to that mission? What's my role within that? And again, a lot of organizations forget this as part of like performance management, but it's even more important where you kind of reiterate this where people work remotely. So make sure you constantly remind them of the values of your organization, the mission statement that you have, and why you exist, and how their role fits within that. It's all about keeping people engaged and connected to that. Again, communication is absolute key. I'm not going to go down into that again, but communication is absolute key to keep that culture up as well. Because again, if you don't communicate, if people don't feel they can communicate, they feel isolated, and you lose that engagement very quickly, no matter what you do. Of course, make sure you do performance management. And again, in performance management, it's a good opportunity to remind them what their role is, obviously their performance within that role. We can set objectives that stretch and work towards our organizational goals. But again, also, whenever we do performance management, we're not just looking at output, we're also looking at behaviors, right? And these behaviors should align to the values that we have within our organization. So how do you deliver that output? Yes, it's all great that you've managed to succeed in your objectives, but have you done that in line with our values? Have you done that in line with our ethics? Very important when we do performance management to keep that culture up as well. Now, beware of pitfalls. The pitfalls are very much all the time. People feeling disengaged, feeling lonely. One of the things we tend to see when people work remotely, especially if it's permanently from home, you tend to see that people get a real kind of opposite to the work-life balance. That border between work and private life erodes massively, and they just fall away and start to kind of mix their private life and their work life. You start seeing them logging in at 8 o'clock in the evening, 12 o'clock at night. That's stuff that we want to avoid because that's not healthy, that's not good, and we still have a responsibility to look after their well-being. And that's absolutely key in that final part. Prioritize well-being, make sure people are well, make sure they don't work outside the regular hours, make sure that people feel, well rested in their days, especially when they work remote, because again, there's always a laptop there they can open up whenever they want to. Make sure they rest well, make sure they take their time to have that private life, to be with their family, be with their friends, and at the same time only work at the times that you would expect them to work, not in those evenings or nights, because that's often a sign of much bigger issues and stress that they might face. Now we'll get to questions in a bit, but I just want to quickly mention as well, obviously, we only have an hour together here totally with us. But at Root HR, as I said earlier, we're a CIC, we are supporting social sector employers. And so we do put a lot of free resources out there. We have webinars, toolkits, fact sheets, blogs, employment law bulletins that come out every quarter with the latest updates on what happens in the world of employment law. And we offer a 1 hour free consultancy. So if you are dealing with an issue and you need to know how to kind of get out of that, or you're planning to do something and you're not entirely sure how to follow that process, you can call us, no strings attached. You can have a 1 hour free consultation. And if you don't want to use it after that again, you're entirely free to do so. We really want to help the sector. We really are there to support you all in your employment matters. And that's really all from me. So I'm handing back to Tim and I'll stop sharing.
That's brilliant, Jimmy. Thank you so much for that. Now I've got lots of questions that are coming out of that, but before I ask some questions and before we ask the our guest to ask questions, I just want to introduce Brendan, our next guest from NatWest Social Community Captial, our webinar partners. And Brendan, I was hoping you could reflect on some of the issues raised by Jimmy's presentation and add some of your own thoughts. And I know that from the perspective of a social investor, you're obviously working with social enterprise leaders all the time. You're making your investment decisions partly on who their team is, who their leadership team is, but you're also, once you're investing in them, you're working with them often, on the coalface. They're dealing with a lot of these issues, both positive and negative. So I wonder, what points would you like to draw out? What issues are you seeing at the moment? So over to you, Brendan, for some thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thanks, Jimmy. That was really interesting. I think that from a social lender's point of view, what we do look at is the kind of the strength of the senior leadership team. So do they have the skill set to kind of drive the growth of the organization? So for example, if they're shifting from maybe grant funding into commercial contracts, do they have the kind of the skill set and experience to understand the contracts, the terms, and everything like that as well? So we do look at the overall kind of senior leadership team and the employees and the staff, and how best fitted they are to kind of drive the organization, to run it, to grow it. But there's a lot of things that kind of Jimmy talked about that was really kind of relevant in that. I think that some of the key takeaways for me was the kind of the communication is key side of it. And one of the things he talked about was that kind of trial period, which I think was really interesting. So making a quick decision, but looking at potentially giving that trial period where you're empowering the employee, and you're probably giving them that kind of trust in them as well. I think you touched on that was a big part of it, that sees productivity go up. And I think that's a really good option to have, to look at trialing things. Don't be scared to trial things out, and if it works, then you can continue with it. But if it doesn't work, then you can kind of show a business case as to why it didn't work, to justify a decision. But one of the things I liked as well was what Jimmy was kind of talking about around that best practices versus laws. So just because it's law doesn't mean you have to be robust about that. You can look at best practices, which kind of will offer additional kind of benefits through the productivity and the culture side of things as well. But one topic that does come up a good bit when we're looking at it and reviewing kind of applications for funding is around that kind of 0 hours contract side of it. So I think the social sector uses it really well in the right way to offer an additional kind of flexibility, but it's got a bit of a stigma around it, around that kind of corporate world, how they use it. I won't name any organizations, but I'm sure lots of them come to mind, where they maybe abuse that 0 hours contract. And just question to Jimmy is around that kind of, how is it used best, and what's his kind of views on 0 hour contracts, and is there anything that people can look at to, I suppose, embed it in the right way, like take proactive stance around kind of designing a 0 hours contract?
Yeah, and what is a 0 hours contract in the first place, Jimmy? So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, whenever we talk about 0 hour contract, I mean, we talk about variable hours, really, aren't we? We're not talking, so
Yeah.
we're not guaranteeing you a minimum amount of hours. And it comes in two forms. One is the more exclusive form where we actually have casual workers. These people are not employees by law. And so they have the right to refuse shifts offered to them. But it also means they don't have opportunities to go to a tribunal, for example. And those contracts I would try to stay away from if possible, simply because obviously that it removes a lot of rights on those individuals. And then the other one is where you have employees, so they cannot refuse a shift offered to them at the time of offering. But I think that again, what I think the best practice of that is to have some kind of system where in advance you can, say, hey, here's some shifts available. We have a bank of staff on 0 hour contracts. Let's talk to them and see who can fill those shifts rather than just telling them to do it. But also be aware what preferences people have. Like, can people work on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays, for example, rather than just kind of guessing what hours they can work. So I think having communication with those members of staff, kind of finding out what their preferred days are to work, even preferred hours for that matter, and then try to find a way of rotating people in advance rather than a week before, to see if they fit in that. Now, of course, there's going to be moments where that might not be entirely possible, because of course the reason why you have 0 hour contract is to essentially deal with highs and lows within your demand. But trying to give it much advance notice, talk to your staff, understand what they prefer, and try to find shifts within that. And I think the other thing is, and this is actually a key one I always tell clients, is if you find that a 0 hour member of staff is consistently doing a certain amount of hours every week, change the contract. Start moving them towards an actual minimum hour contract, because clearly you're doing that anyway. And over time, the longer that goes on, it becomes custom practice, and then it just becomes contractual, even if it's not on paper. So actually, by formalizing that, and that's something that the government wanted to do back in September, and they, for some reason, didn't go ahead with it. But I know they want to introduce something in the future where essentially employees can ask for a minimum guaranteed hours if they are working consistent hours over time. So it's going to become law anyway at some point. But I think, again, from a best practice point of view, you can already start that and start looking at, are there consistent hours people working, and can we offer them a contract to reflect that?
So it's for the employer to be kind of proactive in noticing these patterns and taking the first steps.
Yeah, that's what I would do.
Okay.
I really like the kind of the cultural side of things that you mentioned about kind of making sure that people, you can talk about the mission statement a lot and the organizational values, and kind of to remind employees where they fit within the organization. So there's a sense of belonging and a sense of kind of ownership within that mission statement, that you're playing a part to get to align to the mission statement, that you are a valid kind of employee, which I think is sometimes it's good to remind people when you're working remotely and you're not kind of part of that kind of in-person team, in a sense.
Totally. And I think certain roles, it's very obvious, right, that you work towards a particular mission, and some roles, it's not that obvious at all. Like if you're a finance officer, and you work with spreadsheets and accountancy software all the time, it's very hard, if you're not being reminded of those missions, that actually that's what you're working towards as well.
But they are vital people within the organization.
Exactly. So you really want to make sure that you still remind them that, because what they do allows other people then to obviously collectively work towards that mission goal. So I think it's very important to constantly remind people, because I think sometimes people can be blinded and don't see that necessarily.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's certainly a very important thing, especially within our social enterprise or employer. It's so key to do that.
Great. We got a sort of few questions in the chat, and in particular, quite a lot of input from Adrian Ashton, who's a sort of long-term supporter and engager with Pioneers Post. Some very interesting points Adrian is making, and I wondered if Adrian was willing, could we spotlight him and invite him in to ask some of these questions. So there are questions about the fact that a lot of social enterprises are retail business models. So how do we, it's harder to allow retail business models to allow for flexibility there. And there are various other questions there that Adrian has posed that I think would be useful to go through. Adrian, are you there?
Yes.
Hi.
Hello, this is Denmark calling. I have the results from the panel for the Eurovision. Oh no, that's the other Zoom call, isn't it? Sorry. Yes, so
nice
thank
to
you,
hear
Tim.
from you. Yeah.
Thank you. Jimmy and Brendan as well, as Tim's kind of tried to politely say, I'm a bit more of a stick poker at things when I kind of come across stuff. And I think this morning has been, I think for many people on the call, it would have been a really useful introduction to the idea of thinking about how can we flex our mindsets about how we work as an employer, as a social enterprise, in doing the right thing. And my kind of idea is that in the 5 minutes we've got left and the time you had this morning, that kind of gives no time at all to kind of really dig into this stuff. So my interest was...
Well, you've gone, Adrian.
Has that hiccup. So I think my interest was just in trying to help widen that debate and discussion. We can't cover it in the 3 minutes left this morning, but I think for many social enterprises, it's just to have those prompts so that when they come back to Jimmy, when they go back to their other supporters, they're kind of thinking, yeah, this is the stuff we should be having more conversations about. This is the stuff we shouldn't be struggling with on our own. Based on my kind of work over the sector. And this, by the way, the tinsel is because I try and, as it's my tribute to the Blue Peter Advent Crown. So every
Very
week
good.
there's a bit more.
Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, and to be fair on Jimmy, by the way, he did say when we were talking through this, gosh, I've got enough to do several 3-hour webinars on this. And obviously, you know, these coffee breaks are about just giving a snippet, and what we hope to do afterwards is share some resources and signposts and things. And Jimmy obviously has very kindly offered you know, the kind of 1-hour consultations and things as well. But yeah, I mean, you've mentioned all sorts of things in the chat, and we can maybe address some of those specifically in the article we do afterwards. But Jimmy, any further thoughts on what Adrian has said?
Yeah, I mean, like Adrian said, I mean, it's a very wide topic, isn't it? And there's so many different angles you can attack this from. And we have to recognize that flexible work is not for everyone. It's not for every employer. There's going to be moments where certain roles are just not suitable for flexible work, and you're restricted by the very nature of those roles. And I think that's something that we need to manage with people, because not everyone always agrees to that. I have seen flexible working requests to work from home when people actually were working in a shop. And it's like, well, I don't understand how you kind of got there, but we need to really understand why that you made that request. Like, how did you? What was the thinking process there? And again, a kind of a protest from a position of trust and try to understand, obviously, the employee, because there might be a very good reason for it. But I think from a wider society point of view as well, obviously flexible working, we hear very big voices, CEOs, especially from the private sector, who are constantly telling people and are very public about it, that remote workers are lazy, that people who want to have flexible working are not good workers. And this is stuff that's simply not true. We see a lot of good people working remotely. We see a lot of people who are doing their absolute best to deliver to the mission and the objectives of the organization. And I think we should recognize that as employees as well. And I think just in general, I think flexible working is such a good thing because it can support so many people where you can make it happen, especially people with disabilities, especially people who have caring responsibilities, whether it's for family members or children. I think is absolutely key.
I mean, as a starting point, how do you set a? I mean, obviously, again, this could be a whole webinar itself, but, you know, presumably you've got to actually, first of all, think about, well, how do I set a flexible working policy? I mean, as you say, there are laws and things, but you've got to have an idea of, well, what works for me as an organization and what do I think is going to be fair and equitable across the team?
Totally. I mean, I think you always have to start from the point of how can we make this work, right? Yeah. So look at your service delivery. How do you deliver that? Can I fit within a flexible working model, and what would that model look like? Yeah. And then work from there to see what's possible. But I would also try, once you kind of have an idea of what you can do and if there's anything you can do, is perhaps to start involving the staff in a kind of informal consultation where you say, hey, look, we're looking at introducing some kind of flexibility within our working practices. We would love to hear from you what that might look like. How do you envision that? Especially in larger organizations where you have multiple teams, maybe multiple locations, actually having an understanding of how each department, each person thinks about that can be incredibly valuable in essentially setting such a practice or a policy in place.
And with smaller teams, a lot of social enterprises are quite small as well. I mean, is it more difficult with a smaller team?
We have less
also tend to
resources
get
available.
Sorry?
There are less resources available,
Yeah.
which of course is obviously a lot more difficult to manage than if people start working remotely and you need people to be in the office, for example.
Yeah.
But I would say it's not necessarily more difficult because the processes can be a lot more streamlined, considering there's less people going to be involved in the process itself.
Yeah.
And obviously setting some kind of flexible working practice in place, again, involving the staff within that, especially within smaller enterprises, should be relatively straightforward. But you should have some idea whether you can do it or not. Obviously,
Right.
if you have found that actually it's not going to be practicable for your organization, then don't entice the employees and make them think you're going to introduce something you can't do.
And how about seeing it from the other side? If you're some small business leaders or social enterprise leaders can be quite inflexible and quite controlling, it's and fearful of what happens if they allow flexibility. If you're part of a team and you can see the benefits of flexibility, but you've got a kind of very controlling leader, what can you do to kind of suggest change apart from resign?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of studies available at the moment online that you can access that make the case for flexible working. There's also a lot of cases that show the opposite, because often once you have something in place for several years, like if you look at Scandinavia, for example, where they've been doing a 4-day working week for quite a long time now, you start seeing studies coming out there saying it's actually going the wrong way. But generally speaking, if you actually look at the overall results of studies done, surveys done, flexible working has overall a positive impact on productivity, the bottom line, service delivery, and general engagement from staff, retention and attraction. So therefore a reduction of cost. So you can make a very good argument, and I think you can make a very good return on investment argument as well, because it's very little investment for officer now. Good.
Okay. And we need to finish fairly soon, but I want just to ask a little bit more about, you mentioned kind of making sure that if you are working from home, then you've got, a chair and a desk and the right tech, etc. How much do you set a budget for that? What legally are you required to do? Do you have to pay for heating and telephone and that sort of stuff? Where do the kind of, how do you draw the lines and work out what's fair?
So legally, you are required to make sure you have a safe working environment, right?
Yeah.
But you're not legally required to pay for the equipment to have it at home. It could be the employee's responsibility. You just need to make sure it's in place so it can work safely. What I do recommend, of course, is if you do offer some kind of hybrid working, is like you said, to have some kind of budget for each employee that you set aside for a chair, a desk, a lamp.
Right.
And it's only if they work remotely all the time and there's no opportunity for them to work from home, from the office, that you can make a tax-free payment of £6 a week. But again, there's no legal requirement because people can claim that from HMRC directly.
Right. Okay. Gosh, so many more things that we could talk about, but we have come to the end of our time. I'm going to ask Brendan and then Jimmy just to share, each of you, if you could share one lesson or top tip that you think or thought to go away with. And then, as I say, we'll share a lot of other resources and things in the write-up. So Brendan, a last thought from you.
Thanks. So I think one thing that kind of stood out to me, and I never really thought about it before, was that offering a trial period to support with decision making. So the trial period, it may turn out the employee doesn't like it, doesn't work for them, or it may turn out the employer kind of sees the benefit of it and wants to embed it more. So I think that's kind of one of the key takeaways for me, is that kind of offering trial period and looking at best practices above what the law states.
Yeah, try things out. It's good.
Yeah.
Good tip. Yeah. And Jimmy, what's your final thought?
I mean, I might go slightly off topic here, but I'm thinking Christmas parties. It's the time of Christmas parties and
Yeah.
bringing your staff together, and that can always be a very good time. But I
Yeah.
think employees need to think about their responsibility within that as well, and just be aware that even though it's a Christmas party and it's off-site, you're still responsible for whatever happens at a Christmas party. We did a great block on that quite recently on your responsibilities in line with, of course, the recent legislation that came into place on sexual harassment. So just think about your responsibility within that. There's a lot of alcohol involved often, and so we need to really make sure we manage that in a way where it's a party that's enjoyable for everyone who attends.
Great. So I would recommend people go and read Jimmy's blog and all the other resources on on the website. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks so much, Jimmy, for preparing all that information and for being willing to share it. Thanks to all our speakers, of course, to Karis as well earlier on, and to our webinar producer, Dave, who's behind the scenes making it all happen. Thanks, as always, to our partners at NatWest Social Community Captial. Our social business coffee break discussions will return in the new year, so look out for details in our newsletter and on social media, and we'll be publishing this video and story in the next couple of weeks on our channels soon. Please also look out for announcements for our WISE 100 Women in Social Enterprise Awards. The nominations will be opening for these in the next 2 weeks and will be open until mid-February. So please look out for those. And many thanks to all of you for joining us. Have a lovely day and rest of your week, and goodbye.